The maul came down with a crack that split the rail clean in two, and Julia Talbot did not pause to wipe the rain from her eyes before she set the next length of timber upright and swung again. The year was 1874, and the land around Harlan Creek, Texas, was the kind that asked everything of a person and gave back only what they fought for. Julia had been fighting for 3 years now, ever since the fever took Thomas in the autumn and left her with 40 acres, a half-finished fence line, a 9-year-old daughter named Nora, and a debt to the Harlan Creek Mercantile that could swallow a lesser woman whole. She was not a lesser woman. She was 31 years old, brown-haired and sharp-eyed, with hands that had grown calloused in ways Thomas had never intended for her when he brought her out from Georgia as a bride. She did not resent those calluses. She had earned them. The rain that morning had come in from the northwest, low and gray and persistent, the kind of Texas rain that did not announce itself with thunder but simply arrived and settled in like an unwanted guest who knew he was unwanted and chose to stay anyway. Julia had been at the fence line since before sunrise, while Nora was still asleep in the house. The timber needed to go in before the ground froze again, and it would freeze again, this being November and the land being contrary in every way a land could be contrary. She set the wedge into the next length, lifted the maul, and brought it down. The rail split. She threw the two halves onto the pile and reached for the next length. She did not hear the horse until it was nearly at the edge of the pasture. When she looked up, squinting through the curtain of rain, she saw a big sorrel gelding picking its careful way through the mud along the fence row, and on its back a man she recognized from a distance the way you recognize trouble before you can name it specifically. Clayton Ramsey. 34 years old, owner of the Rocking R ranch that bordered her property along the eastern line, a man who had the kind of jaw that was set from birth to look as though it was keeping an argument inside it, and who had, in the 3 years since Thomas died, done a number of things for Julia Talbot without being asked to do any of them, and without ever making her feel indebted for a single one. He had fixed her roof after the September storm 2 years ago. He had sent 2 of his hands to help drive her small herd to market when she broke her wrist in the spring of '73. He had, on 3 separate occasions, appeared at her property line at moments when something needed doing and done it without ceremony or conversation about what a fine thing he was doing. Julia did not know what to make of Clayton Ramsey. She had decided on most days that she did not need to make anything of him at all. He pulled the sorrel up short of the fence and dismounted in one unhurried motion, tying the reins to the post she had set yesterday. He walked toward her through the rain with his hat low and his coat collar turned up, and he did not look like a man who was bothered by being wet. He stopped about 10 feet from her and looked at the pile of split rails and then at the maul in her hands and then at her face. "Mrs. Talbot," he said. "Mr. Ramsey," she said, and set the next rail upright. "I came out here to do that," he said. She looked at him over her shoulder. "Do what?" "Split those rails." He said it simply, the way a man says something that he believes requires no defense. "I came to do that, and I also came to ask you something." Julia set down the maul. Not because she was giving up the work, but because there was something in the way he said those 2 things that deserved her full attention. She turned to face him in the rain, the mud at her boots, her hair plastered against her cheeks, and she folded her arms across her chest in the way that she knew men read as a warning but which was, for her, simply the posture she took when she was thinking carefully. "You can ask," she said. "I make no promises about the answer." Clayton Ramsey looked at her for a moment with those steady gray eyes of his, and she thought she saw something in them that she could not immediately categorize. Something careful and deliberate and nervous all at once, which struck her as remarkable because, in 3 years of knowing him, she had never once seen Clayton Ramsey look nervous. "Let me split the rails first," he said. She considered this. "You did not ride out here in the rain to split my rails first and ask your question second, Mr. Ramsey. You rode out here to ask the question and thought splitting rails would give you something to do with your hands while you worked up to it." He was quiet for a moment. Then a slow, reluctant smile moved across one corner of his mouth, the kind of smile that arrived against a man's better judgment. "That is a fair assessment," he said. "Then ask," she said. He took off his hat and held it in both hands, and the rain fell straight down onto his dark hair and ran along the angle of his jaw, and Julia Talbot told herself that she was not going to feel anything about that particular sight, and then felt something about it anyway. "I would like to court you, Julia," he said. "Properly, if you are willing to entertain the idea. I know you have been on your own a long while, and I know you did not ask for my help with any of the things I helped with, and I know you are not a woman who needs a man to get through a day. But I would like the chance to try to be worth your time. And I thought if I was going to ask something like that, I ought to at least be honest about it and not dress it up in something else." Julia Talbot stood in the rain and listened to those words and let them settle. She had not expected that. She had expected him to say he had heard about the mercantile debt, which had grown to $42 and which she was 3 months behind on, and that he wanted to make some offer of financial assistance that she would have refused with more politeness than she actually felt. She had expected him to offer to buy the Eastern 40, which Gideon Hart at the bank had been after her to sell for 2 years. She had expected almost anything except Clayton Ramsey standing in the rain with his hat in his hands saying that he wanted to court her properly. "That is a plain thing to say," she said. "I am a plain man," he said. She looked at him for a long moment, this man who had shown up at her fence line in a November rainstorm with mud on his boots and something honest in his eyes. And she thought about Thomas, who had been gone 3 years, and who she had loved with the love of a young woman who had not yet learned what love cost, and who she grieved still with a quiet grief that lived in the back rooms of her heart and did not come out often but was always there. And she thought about Nora, asleep in the house, who was 9 years old and needed a world that was stable. And she thought about 40 acres of Texas land, and a fence that needed splitting, and a debt at the mercantile, and the way the winter was already showing its teeth. "I will not lie to you, Mr. Ramsey," she said. "I am not in a position to think about courtship the way a woman with fewer troubles might think about it. I have a daughter and a debt and a property that will consume all of my attention until spring at the earliest." "I know that," he said, "and I am not looking for someone to rescue me," she said. "I have been clear about that with a great many people over the last 3 years. "I know that too," he said. "I am not offering rescue, I am offering company, and I am being honest about why." The rain came down steadily between them. A crow called somewhere in the post oaks along the creek. Julia uncrossed her arms and looked down at the pile of split rails and then back at him. "You can split the rails," she said, "and we will talk. That is all I am saying right now." He nodded, once, as if she had handed him something he intended to take good care of. He rolled his coat sleeves back and picked up the maul she had set down, and he split rails while she stacked them, and the rain kept on and the morning moved forward, and neither of them said the things they were thinking right away, because neither of them was the kind of person who said everything at once. They had met properly for the first time at the general store in Harlan Creek in the winter of '71, a few weeks after Thomas died. Julia had been there to settle an account, and Clayton had been there for harness leather, and Abel Cross behind the counter had introduced them the way people in small Texas towns introduced each other, which was with full knowledge of everything about both parties. He knew Clayton Ramsey ran the Rocking R and had been running it alone since his father died 6 years ago. He knew Julia Talbot had come from Georgia with her husband and her small daughter, and had now lost her husband to a fever that had taken 4 people in the county that autumn. Clayton had removed his hat and said he was sorry for her loss, and he had meant it. Julia had thanked him and paid her account and left, and she had thought afterward that he had the look of a man who said what he meant and not a word extra, and that this was a quality she had come to appreciate in a world full of men who said a great many words and meant very few of them. In the months that followed, their paths crossed regularly. Harlan Creek was not a large town. It had a general store run by Abel Cross, a livery run by a man named Pete Deacon who chewed tobacco and spat with impressive accuracy, a small church where Reverend Miles preached on Sundays with the enthusiasm of a man who believed every word he was saying, a doctor's office where Dr. Emmett Vance treated everything from snakebite to heartbreak with equal calm, and a saloon called the Dusty Rose that Julia Talbot had never once entered and did not intend to. There was also a land office where a man named Gideon Hart worked, and it was Gideon Hart who had been the quiet difficulty in Julia's life for 2 years running. Hart wanted the eastern 40 of the Talbot property. He had a buyer, he said. A good price, he said. Thomas had owed the bank a sum that had been refinanced twice, and Hart held the paper on it, and he was not a man who forgot that he held paper. He was polite about it in the way that people are polite when they believe politeness is the most effective form of pressure. Julia had refused him in January of 72, in March of 72, in August of 72, and twice in 73. Each time she refused, Hart had smiled with all his teeth and said he understood completely, and that his offer would remain open whenever she was ready to be sensible about her situation. She did not like the word sensible when it came from Gideon Hart. What he did not know, what she had not told anyone yet because she was still calculating whether it was true, was that she had a good herd this year. 23 head of solid cattle that she had grown from the 12 Thomas left her, and the calf crop had been better than expected, and if she could get them to market in the spring at a fair price, she would be in a position to pay off both the bank debt and the mercantile and have something left to plant. It was not a certainty. Nothing in Texas in 1874 was a certainty, but it was a real possibility, and real possibilities were worth protecting. Clayton Ramsey knew about the herd. He had seen them at the fence line any number of times, and he was a man who understood cattle and could count, and she suspected he had done the arithmetic the same way she had. He had not mentioned it. He had not mentioned the debt or Hart's offers or any of the things that people in a small town inevitably knew about each other. He had just done the things that needed doing when he was in a position to do them, and had apparently been working up to standing in the rain with his hat in his hands for a good while before he finally did it. She thought about all of this while she stacked rails and watched him work. He was good with the maul. That was obvious. He swung it with the efficiency of a man who had been splitting timber since before he needed to shave, with his whole body behind each stroke and not a motion wasted. The pile grew steadily. She moved each split rail to the stack with both hands, her back aching in the way it ached every morning now after years of this work, and the rain continued without apology. After an hour he stopped and straightened and looked at the sky. "It is not going to ease up," he said. "No," she agreed. "Mrs. Talbot," he said, and then corrected himself. "Julia, would you be willing to go inside and have coffee, or does that seem too much like progress in a direction you have not decided on yet?" The directness of that made her laugh, which surprised her. She had not laughed easily since Thomas died, and she was always slightly startled when it happened naturally. The laugh was short and genuine, and she did not apologize for it. "I have been standing in this rain for 3 hours," she said. "Coffee is not a declaration of intent. Coffee is coffee." He picked up his coat from the fence post where he had hung it and followed her through the pasture gate and across the muddy yard to the porch. He stomped his boots on the wooden step and left his hat on the hook outside the door, and she noticed this, the fact that he did not carry his hat inside, which was a small thing but a considered one. The kind of small courtesy that people either were raised with or were not. Nora was at the table doing her lessons when they came in. She was 9 years old and had Thomas's dark eyes and Julia's stubborn mouth, and she looked up at Clayton Ramsey with the open assessment of a child who has learned to size up adults quickly. "Good morning, Mr. Ramsey," Nora said. "Good morning, Miss Nora," he said. "How are your lessons?" "Arithmetic," Nora said. "I do not enjoy arithmetic." "Neither did I," he said. "I still do not, but it is useful." "That is what Mama says," Nora said, with the tone of someone who has heard a thing too many times to find it convincing. Julia set the coffee pot over the fire and stood near the stove to warm her hands, and Clayton sat in the chair she indicated, without taking the one at the head of the table, which had been Thomas's chair, and which she had never yet offered to anyone. He looked around the kitchen with the look of a man who notices how a place is maintained, and what he saw was a clean and ordered house that showed the constant effort of a woman who would not let her standards slip regardless of what else was slipping. The kitchen was small but functional, a cast iron stove that she had repaired herself twice, a pine table with 4 mismatched chairs, a shelf of preserved goods, considerably fuller now than it had been in the winter of '72, a window over the dry sink that looked out toward the barn, and through which Julia could see her cattle standing in the rain with the philosophically resignation of animals who understood that weather was not personal. Nora finished her arithmetic and asked if she could go to the barn to check on the mare, and Julia said yes, and Nora put on her coat and went out, and then it was just the two of them in the kitchen with the coffee and the sound of rain on the roof. "Tell me something," Julia said, pouring his cup. "Not about the courtship, something else. Tell me about your property. Tell me what you are working on this winter." She watched him consider the question and accept it as the terms it was, the terms being that she wanted to know who he was as a person and a rancher before she knew anything about what he wanted from her. He told her about the new pasture he was clearing on the north end of the Rocking R, which had been grown over with cedar and scrub oak for 10 years, and which he was reclaiming 1 acre at a time. He told her about his cattle, which were better bred than most in the county, because his father had bought a Hereford bull from a man in Kansas 8 years ago, and the bloodline had improved steadily since. He told her about the 3 hands he employed year-round, a man named Moses Webb who had been foreman at the Rocking R since before Clayton's father died, and who knew every piece of that land better than Clayton knew his own reflection, and 2 younger men named Dalt and Hector who were respectively 22 and 24, and were, in Clayton's assessment, good workers who needed constant reminding that they were working. He told her this without embellishment and without diminishment, the same way he split rails, with efficiency and without wasted motion. Julia drank her coffee and listened and asked questions when she had them, and he answered each question without getting defensive or evasive, and she thought that this was either genuine plainness of character or a very sophisticated performance of it, and she had been around enough people to believe she could tell the difference. She thought it was genuine. Nora came back in from the barn smelling of horse and hay, and announced that the mare had a loose shoe, and was it all right if she asked Mr. Ramsey to look at it before he left, because she had seen him fix a shoe before at the Hendersons' place, and he had done it very well. Clayton looked at Julia, and Julia looked at her daughter, and said that if Mr. Ramsey had time it would be appreciated. He fixed the mare's shoe in the barn while Nora held the lantern, and Julia stood in the barn door watching the rain and listening to Nora ask him questions about horses with the relentless curiosity of a 9-year-old who has decided a person is worth interrogating. He answered every question. He did not talk down to her or brush her off, and when she asked a question he did not know the answer to, he said he did not know and suggested where she might find out, which was the most honest thing an adult could do with a child's question, and the thing most adults failed to do. When he left, he said he hoped she would think about what he had asked, and that there was no urgency, and that he would not bring it up again until she wanted to discuss it. Then he mounted the sorrel and rode back through the mud toward the Rocking R, and Julia watched him go from the porch until the rain and the distance took him from sight. Nora stood beside her. "I like him," Nora said. "I know you do," Julia said. "Do you?" Julia put her hand on her daughter's wet hair. "Go inside and finish your lessons." Nora went inside without further comment, which was itself a kind of wisdom. Julia stayed on the porch for a moment longer. The rain came down. The fence line waited. The pile of split rails was the largest it had been since she started. She went inside and did not think about Clayton Ramsey for the rest of the day, and then thought about him most of the evening, and did not think about that either. The following Sunday at church, which was a small white building at the north end of Harlan Creek that held 40 people comfortably, and was full most weeks because the community was not so large that people had elsewhere to be. Julia sat in the third pew from the front with Nora beside her. Clayton Ramsey sat 4 rows behind her with Moses Webb, who was a tall, quiet black man of about 50 who had been freed at the end of the war and had chosen to stay in Texas and stay at the Rocking R because, as he had told Julia once when she asked, the land there was good and the man who ran it treated him fair, which combination was worth more than he could find most other places, and he was not wrong about that. Julia was aware of this injustice in the way that all the honest people of Harlan Creek were aware of it, which was to say that she knew Moses Webb was as capable and as deserving as any man in the county, and that the world he lived in did not treat him as such, and she treated him with the respect and directness he deserved, and she knew that Clayton did the same, and this told her something about Clayton's character that she filed away carefully. After the service, Reverend Miles stood at the door and shook hands and said things that were meant to be comforting and usually were, and people gathered on the grass outside in the pale November sun that had followed the rain, and Julia spoke with Agnes Henderson about the coming cold and with Dr. Vance about a cough that Nora had developed, and that the doctor said was nothing to worry about, just seasonal, just the dry cold air, just give her honey and steam. Clayton Ramsey made no move to approach her, as he had said he would not. He spoke with Moses and with Pete Deacon and with Reverend Miles, and he looked in her direction once, and she happened to be looking in his direction at the same moment, and they both looked away, and Julia felt something move in her chest that she had not felt in a very long time, and that she was not entirely sure she was glad to feel. Gideon Hart was at church too, as he always was. He was a man of about 40, with neat, expensive clothes, and the permanent expression of someone doing mental calculations about everything they saw. He found Julia near the gate and asked after her health and after Nora's health, and then said, as he always did, that his offer on the Eastern 40 remained open, and he did hope she was thinking practically about her situation. Julia said she was thinking very practically, thank you, and wished him good day. It was only after she turned away that she noticed Clayton Ramsey had moved to within earshot during the last portion of that exchange. He said nothing about it. He simply fell into step beside her and Nora as they walked toward the wagon, which was another thing she had not expected and which she did not object to. Is he persistent? Clayton said, not quite a question. Like weather, Julia said. He has been making offers on pieces of property all along this creek for 2 years, Clayton said. He tried to buy the north edge of the Rocking R last spring. I declined. I did not know that, Julia said. He told me my father had overpaid for that land and that I could do better to sell it and put the money into something more liquid. Clayton was quiet for a moment. He used the word liquid about my father's land. I imagine that went well, Julia said. About as well as you would expect, he said, and there was that reluctant smile again, the one that arrived against his better judgment. They reached her wagon. He helped Nora up onto the seat, and then offered his hand to Julia, and she took it, and the contact lasted no more than 3 seconds, but it was warm and solid, and she let herself register it before she put it away somewhere in the back of her mind, where she was storing all of the things about Clayton Ramsey that she was not yet prepared to examine directly. Thank you, she said. Of course, he said. She drove home through the November countryside, through the post oaks and the dry grass and the long pale light, and Nora hummed something tuneless and contentedly beside her, and Julia thought about what it meant that she had not asked him to walk with them and he had walked with them anyway, and that she had not minded. It was 3 weeks before she saw him again in any meaningful way. Not because either of them arranged it so, but because November in Texas is a busy month and 40 acres does not run itself, and neither does the Rocking R. She saw him in town twice, briefly, and they exchanged the kind of greetings that carry more information than their words suggest. She heard from Agnes Henderson, who heard from Pete Deacon, who had heard it from someone else, that Clayton Ramsey had turned down an offer from a cattle buyer out of Dallas, who had wanted to buy most of his herd at a price that was lower than fair because the buyer had calculated he could undercut Clayton on the grounds that the Rocking R was a one-man operation, and that one man had fewer options than a large outfit. Clayton had told him to ride on. She did not know why this particular piece of information pleased her, but it did. The refusal of an unfair offer from a man who thought you had no choice was something she understood entirely. The meaningful encounter happened in December, 2 days before Christmas, when Julia drove into Harlan Creek to pick up the things she had ordered from the mercantile for the holiday. Abel Cross had the package ready, and she was loading it into the wagon bed when she heard raised voices from the street. She turned to see Gideon Hart in conversation, though conversation was not quite the right word for it, with a young man she did not recognize, a cowboy of about 25 with trail dust on his coat and an expression that was moving rapidly from confused to angry. Hart was saying something in a low, insistent voice, and the young man was shaking his head. Two of Hart's men, large and deliberate and standing where they were standing on purpose, were present at the edges of the scene. Julia looked away. This was not her business. Then Clayton Ramsey came out of the hardware store across the street and walked directly into the middle of it. He did not raise his voice. He said something to Hart that Julia could not hear from where she stood, and said something else to the young cowboy, and the geometry of the situation changed. Hart's two men looked at each other and then at Hart. Hart said something back to Clayton, still low, still controlled, but with an edge to it that Julia could see even at this distance. Clayton listened, said one more thing, and then the young cowboy picked up his horse's reins and led the animal down the street toward the livery, and Hart's men drifted back, and Hart looked at Clayton for a long moment with a look that Julia recognized as the look of a man who is revising his calculations. She had finished loading the wagon by the time Clayton crossed the street to her. "What was that?" she asked. That young man had ridden in looking for work. Hart told him the livery was hiring, which it is not, and then told him that if he wanted to earn in this town, he would need to go through Hart's operation, which is not how hiring works, and which was Hart's way of recruiting someone who needed money badly enough to do things they should not do. Clayton looked down the street where Hart was retreating toward his land office. "I told the young man to go see Moses Webb at the Rocking R. We have had need of another hand, and Moses has been saying so for a month." Julia looked at him. "You did that on purpose," she said. "What? Hired a man so Hart could not use him. You did not just need another hand." Clayton was quiet for a moment. "I did need another hand," he said, and then, "but yes, also that." She appreciated the honesty of the correction. "I want to ask you something now," she said, which surprised him. She could see it. "Ask," he said. "The cattle drive in the spring. I have 23 head. I do not have enough hands to manage the drive and the property at the same time, and I cannot afford to hire them. I have refused your help before because it felt like charity, and I will not accept it as charity now. But I would like to propose something. If you are willing to take my herd along with yours to market in the spring, we could arrange a fair division of the expense and the profit. An actual partnership arrangement with terms on paper, because I will not enter into anything I cannot walk away from fairly if it does not work." He looked at her in a way that she could not entirely read and then said, "Yes. Yes, it is fair terms, or yes, it can be arranged." "Both," he said. "I have been thinking along the same lines. My herd is large enough that adding 23 head is not a significant burden, and the combined drive to Fort Worth makes sense for both of us. I will have Moses write up the terms if you want. He writes better than I do and is more careful about the specifics." "I would like that," she said. "I want to read every word before I sign." "I would expect nothing less," he said. She drove home that day with the Christmas goods in the wagon bed and something lighter in her chest than had been there for a good while. Not hope exactly, because hope was a word she had learned to be careful with. Something more like the beginning of a possibility, which was a more honest description and which she preferred. Christmas that year was quieter than it had been when Thomas was alive, but it was not sad. Julia made a meal that was better than the occasion strictly required, because Nora deserved it, and because Julia herself needed the reminder that good things could be made out of simple ingredients if you had the skill and the willingness. They went to the Christmas service at Reverend Miles's church, and Clayton was there. And after the service, he gave Nora a small carved wooden horse that Moses Webb had made, because Moses was a man of many skills that went unannounced. Nora held it in both hands with the reverence that children reserve for things they recognize as genuinely beautiful, and said thank you with a sincerity that was more adult than her 9 years should have produced. Julia gave Clayton a tin of the spiced pecans she put up every autumn, because it was the right scale of gift between people who were something to each other, but had not yet established precisely what that something was. He thanked her with the same careful sincerity she applied to everything that mattered, and they stood for a while in the cold December air outside the church, while Nora showed Agnes Henderson's children the carved horse, and they talked about the spring drive and the cattle market in Fort Worth, and whether the winter would stay mild or turn hard in January. It turned hard in January. The cold came in on a Thursday with a northwest wind that stripped the last of the dead leaves off the post oaks and drove the temperature down to something that made the cattle huddle against the south side of the barn. Julia spent 3 days doing nothing but keeping the animals alive and the pipes from freezing and the fire in the stove from going out. On the 4th day, Moses Webb rode over with 2 of the rocking R hands, Dalt and Hector, and the new man whose name was Sam Price, who was 25 and had turned out, as Clayton had anticipated, to be a solid worker with a good head for cattle. They brought an extra load of firewood that Clayton had sent, and a message from Clayton that said he would have come himself but that his own north pasture was in trouble and he needed to be there, and that if she needed anything more she should send Nora to the road and Moses would see her. Julia accepted the firewood and sent back a message that she was managing well and that she appreciated it, which was true on both counts. When the cold broke in late January, it broke all at once in the way Texas cold sometimes does, replaced overnight by weather that felt like early March, soft and smelling of damp earth. And Julia rode the fence line on her bay horse to check for damage and found 3 sections that needed resetting and 1 that needed new rails, which she noted and planned for and did not despair over. She rode the fence line on the eastern side, which was the boundary with the rocking R, and she found Clayton at his own fence line on the other side, doing the same assessment. They pulled their horses up at the boundary post and looked at each other across the winter grass. "How much damage?" he asked. 3 sections resetting and 1 new rails. Nothing catastrophic. She looked at his fence. About the same. Moses already has Dalt on the south section." He looked across her pasture at her cattle who were moving slowly through the thin January sunshine with the contented air of animals who have been through a hard thing and come out the other side. "Your herd came through well. They are good stock," she said, with a quiet pride she allowed herself because she had raised them well and she knew it. They rode along the fence line together in the same direction for a while, each on their own side, and talked about the spring arrangements. Moses had drafted the partnership terms and had ridden them over in December, and Julia had read every word as promised and had suggested 2 changes, and Moses had taken them back to Clayton, and Clayton had agreed to both, and Julia had signed, and the thing was done in a proper and businesslike way that she respected entirely. What she had not signed, what had not been formally offered again since that rainy morning in November, was the other thing: the courtship. Clayton had kept his word and not pressed it, and she had kept the thing at the back of her mind where she had put it, and visited it sometimes when she was doing something that did not require full attention, like mending or stirring or watching the stars come out from the porch on the nights when she was too tired to sleep but not tired enough to lie down. She had been thinking about it more in the last few weeks than she had before. She was not sure this was something she wanted to examine directly yet, but she was also aware that January was turning into February, and February would turn into March, and by April the cattle drive would happen, and after that her situation would be materially different in ways that might make certain decisions easier or harder depending on how she approached them. She thought about it when she was checking the fence line. She thought about it when she watched him ride along his side of the boundary, easy and unhurried in the saddle, the way men are who have been on a horse since before they could walk. She thought about the way he had looked at her in the November rain with something nervous in his steady gray eyes, and the way he had kept his word about not pressing, and the way he had sent firewood without making it into a statement about what she should feel about him. "Clayton," she said, and then stopped because she had not entirely decided what came after the name. He looked across the fence at her. She said, "I have been thinking about what you asked in November." He waited. "I am not opposed to it," she said carefully. "I want to be clear that not opposed is not the same as decided, but I wanted you to know that the thinking is happening." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Thank you for telling me that." "I thought you deserved to know," she said. "You kept your word. That deserves something in return." He looked at her for a long time, long enough that she felt the color come into her face and was grateful for the January air that made that unremarkable. "Would you have dinner with me?" he said. "Not at the hotel, I do not mean publicly. I mean at the Rocking R. I can cook adequately, and Moses is a better cook than I am, and Nora is welcome. I would like you to see the place. It seems like something you should see if you are thinking about things." Julia considered this. Seeing the Rocking R meant a thing, socially, in a small town like Harlan Creek. People would know. People would talk. And while she did not organize her life around what people in Harlan Creek said about her, she was not indifferent to it, partly for Nora's sake and partly because reputation was a form of currency in a small community, and she was not in a position to spend any carelessly. But she had also been on her own for 3 years, and she was 31 years old, and she had held together 40 acres of Texas through 2 hard winters and a broken wrist and a mercantile debt, and a bank that wanted pieces of what she had built, and she was tired of decisions being made entirely around what she could not afford to risk. "Sunday after next," she said. "Nora and I." The smile that came to his face then was not the reluctant one. It was the real one, the unguarded kind, and it transformed him in a way that she felt arrive somewhere in her chest with a warmth that she did not talk herself out of this time. "Sunday after next," he agreed. She turned her horse back toward her side of the property and rode home through the pale winter light, and she was smiling too, though there was no one to see it. The dinner at the Rocking R was on a Sunday in early February, clear and cold with a sky so blue it looked painted. Julia drove the wagon with Nora beside her, and Nora had worn her good dress without being asked to, which was a testament to how much the 9-year-old had decided about this situation already. The Rocking R was larger than Julia had understood from the outside. The main house was a long, low ranch house built of good Texas limestone with a deep porch along the front, substantially bigger than her own place but not ostentatious. The house of a man who built for function and permanence rather than impression. There were 3 outbuildings, a large barn, a bunkhouse, and a smaller structure that she later learned was a smokehouse. The pastures were well fenced, and she noticed, as a woman who had been splitting fence rails in the rain not 3 months ago, that the fence lines were straight and sound. Moses Webb came out to meet them at the hitching post, as dignified as ever in a clean wool shirt, and took the wagon horse with the ease of a man who has handled horses his whole life. He told Nora that there was a new foal in the barn if she wanted to see it before supper, and Nora was off at a near run before he had finished the sentence. Clayton was on the porch. He had dressed for the occasion in a way that was considered but not showy, a clean shirt and his best jacket, and he looked in the clear winter light like exactly what he was, A man in his 30s who had built something worth having through the slow, constant application of work and judgment. "You found it all right," he said. "It is not a difficult road," she said. "No," he agreed. "It is not." He showed her the house, which was ordered and clean in the particular way of a bachelor's house that has been well maintained, meaning it was functional and honest about what it was and not decorated for softness but not uncomfortable either. The kitchen had a good stove and a solid table and shelves with the kind of stores that told her he planned ahead and did not leave things to chance. The sitting room had 2 chairs and a fire and a shelf of books, which surprised her, and when she looked at the spines she saw that the books were both practical and various. A farming manual next to a volume of Dickens, next to a history of the Republic of Texas, next to something in what looked like Spanish, which she asked about. "My mother was from San Antonio," he said. "Her family had been in Texas since before it was Texas. She taught me some Spanish, not as much as I should have learned." "Is she still living?" Julia asked. "She died when I was 20, he said. "She would have liked you, I think. She had no patience for people who were not direct." Julia looked at the books and thought about a 20-year-old Clayton Ramsey on this land after his mother died, and then 6 years later after his father died, and the mathematics of solitude that added up to a man who sent firewood in a hard winter and kept his word about not pressing. Moses cooked supper, which was a beef stew that was substantially better than adequate and a corn bread that was excellent, and they ate at the big table in the kitchen, all 4 of them, with Nora providing most of the conversation because she had opinions about the foal and about Moses's cooking, and about a book of illustrated natural history that Clayton had offered to lend her, and which she had already opened twice at the table before Julia told her to put it away until after supper. It was the most ordinary meal Julia had sat down to in 3 years, and it undid her slightly in a way she had not expected. The ordinariness of it. The way Nora talked, and the way Clayton listened to her and asked follow-up questions, and the way Moses refilled the coffee without being asked, and the fire in the stove and the clear night starting outside the window. It was what a life could look like if it included the right people, and she felt the shape of it settle around her like something she had not known she was cold without until she felt the warmth. After supper, Moses took Nora to look at the foal again, and Clayton and Julia sat at the table with the last of the coffee, and it was late enough in the evening that the formality of the occasion had been worn away by hours of company, and they talked the way people talk when they have stopped performing. She told him about Georgia, about the small farm her father had kept, and the way she had grown up knowing how to work land before she knew anything else. She told him about meeting Thomas Talbot at 19, and how he had been full of plans for the West, and how she had believed in those plans because he believed in them with such uncomplicated certainty. She told him about the journey out and about the early years and about the things Thomas had been and the things he had not been, not with bitterness, but with the clear-eyed honesty of a woman who had loved someone without illusion and grieved them without pretending they were something other than what they were. Clayton listened to all of it. He did not offer comparisons or condolences or the kind of practical observations that men sometimes offered when women were speaking about loss, as though loss were a problem to be solved rather than a thing to be heard. He just listened, and when she was done he said, "Thank you for telling me that." "I wanted you to know who you were asking," she said. "I know who I was asking," he said. "I have been watching you run that property for 3 years. I know who you are." "That is not the same as knowing the inside of it," she said. "No," he agreed. "It is not. But the inside is not smaller than the outside. It matches." She looked at him across the table at the firelight on his face and the steadiness in his gray eyes, and she made a decision, not the final decision, but the one that came before it, the one that said she was willing to go further into this thing and see what was there. "I would like to continue," she said. "The courtship. I am saying yes to it if that is still what you are asking." "It is still what I am asking," he said. "I want it to be slow," she said. "I want Nora to have time, I want to have time, and I want it to be honest, If it does not work, I want to be able to say so without a great deal of wreckage. Agreed on all counts, he said. And I will not stop running my property the way I run it, she said. That does not change. I would not want it to, he said, and she believed him. They sat by the fire for another hour talking about smaller things, the coming spring and the cattle market, and a new school that some of the county settlers were trying to organize, which Nora would benefit from considerably. And when Moses came back with Nora, who was falling asleep on her feet from the excitement of the foal and the full supper. They made their farewells, and Clayton helped them into the wagon, and Julia drove home through the February night with the stars very clear overhead, and Nora asleep against her shoulder before they had gone half a mile. She was humming when she got home. She noticed it when she was putting Nora to bed and recognized the melody as a song Thomas had liked. And she stopped and thought about that for a moment, the way the past and the present sat in the same person without contradiction, and decided that humming a song Thomas had liked on the night she agreed to let Clayton Ramsey court her was not a betrayal of anything, but was instead evidence that the heart is capable of holding more than one true thing at a time, and that this was something to be grateful for. February became March, and March was the best month Julia Talbot had known in 3 years. Clayton came to see her twice a week, not always at the house. Sometimes they rode the fence lines together, his on one side and hers on the other, talking across the boundary the way they had in January, and sometimes they met in town at the general store or after church, and occasionally they sat on her porch in the lengthening March evenings while Nora read inside, and the horses stood at the hitching post, and the first green of spring came up through the brown grass of the pasture. She was learning him, in the way you learn someone when you stop keeping them at a careful distance and begin to let them be specific. She learned that he was not a patient man in the conventional sense, but was a persistent one, which was different, meaning he did not wait without frustration, but he did not stop either. She learned that he read seriously and thought carefully, and that when he was wrong about something he admitted it without excessive difficulty, which was not a common quality. She learned that he felt things deeply and expressed them sparingly, and that the sparing expression was not suppression but economy, the same economy he applied to everything, no wasted motion, nothing for effect, everything for purpose. She learned that he had never been close to marrying before, not because there had not been opportunities, but because he had, as he put it one evening on the porch, never met anyone he wanted to talk to in 10 years who was also someone he wanted to talk to in the morning. She had laughed at that, and he had looked at her in the way he sometimes looked at her when she laughed, as though laughter was a thing he had been waiting for and was glad to finally see. She was falling in love with him. She knew it the way you know weather is changing, not from a single sign, but from the accumulation of small signs that add up to something unmistakable. She knew it from the way she thought about him when he was not there, and the way the thinking was not anxious but warm. She knew it from the way Nora had started calling him Clayton without the mister, and the way he had accepted this without comment, and the way this small shift in her daughter's address felt like something being built rather than something being lost. She did not say it yet, neither did he. But the saying of it was present in the space between them like a word that both people know is coming, and are allowing to arrive in its own time. The spring drive happened in April. Clayton and Moses and the 4 hands gathered Julia's 23 head at the east fence and combined them with the rocking R herd, 61 animals, and they started for Fort Worth on a Monday morning with the grass coming up green and the sky wide, and the kind of weather that made you understand why people had come to Texas in the first place. Julia rode out with them for the first day, on her bay horse with her hat low and the warm April wind at her back, and it was the first time she had ridden out on a proper cattle drive since Thomas was alive, and she felt something return to her that she had not known was missing, a sense of herself in motion in the world rather than just holding ground. She turned back at midday as they had agreed. Clayton rode out from the flank to meet her at the turning point. "We should be in Fort Worth in 8 days," he said. I will send word from there and ride back as soon as the cattle are sold. I will be here, she said. He looked at her for a moment, and then he leaned across from his horse and kissed her, which was the first time he had kissed her and which she received without pulling back. It was brief and decisive and warm, and it tasted like the particular combination of leather and spring air and intention that she thought she would remember for a long time. I will be back, he said. I know, she said. She watched the herd move south until it was dusk, and then she turned her horse north and rode home through the green April country, and she did not try to manage what she was feeling. He was gone 11 days because the market was better than either of them had expected, which meant the sale took longer to negotiate, and also meant the return was considerably more profitable than projected. Moses came back 2 days ahead of him to report that the cattle had sold at a good price, and that Clayton's portion of the divided proceeds for Julia's herd would clear both the bank debt and the mercantile and leave her something besides. Julia sat with this information for a long time after Moses left. She sat at the kitchen table with the afternoon light coming through the window and thought about what it meant to be solvent for the first time in 3 years. The debt to Gideon Hart's bank, which she had been carrying like a stone in her boot since Thomas died, would be gone. The mercantile account, which had been a quiet humiliation every time she went into Abel Cross's store, would be settled. She would own her 40 acres outright, owing nothing to no one for the first time since the fever took Thomas. She cried a little, which she allowed herself because she was alone, and because 3 years was a long time to carry something that heavy, and it was appropriate to mark the putting down of it. When Clayton rode into her yard on the 12th day after the drive began, she was in the garden turning the spring soil, and she looked up and watched him tie the sorrel at the post and cross the yard toward her, and she set down the shovel and walked to meet him because there was no reason not to. He handed her the leather pouch with the money from her cattle before he even dismounted fully. She took it and looked at the amount he had written on the paper inside and felt the tears threaten again and pushed them back. "You negotiated well," she said. "I negotiated your cattle the same way I negotiated mine," he said. "The buyer from Kansas wanted to go low on the combined herd." Moses told him where he could put that offer, she laughed. "Good for Moses. He has strong opinions about fair prices," Clayton said. She looked at him in the April afternoon, rode dirty and tired and with the particular look a man gets when he has done a hard thing well and is glad to be home. She thought the word home and registered it and did not qualify it. "Clayton," she said. "Julia." "I am in love with you," she said. "I have been for a while. I thought you should know." He stood very still for a moment. Then he said, "I have been in love with you since the morning I rode out to your fence line and found you splitting rails in the rain. I thought you were the most remarkable woman I had ever seen in my life. You thought you would come fix my fence and ask me something," she said. "I thought I had better do something useful while I still had the nerve," he said, "and that splitting your rails was the most obviously useful thing I could identify at short notice in a November rainstorm." She walked the remaining 2 feet between them and kissed him in the April sunshine, properly this time. Not the brief and decisive kiss of the cattle drive departure, but the kind of kiss that says everything that has been building for months, and that neither of them pulled back from, and that Nora witnessed from the kitchen window, and about which she later said nothing except to go out to the barn and tell the mayor, in great detail, exactly what she had seen. They were engaged by May, which was fast by certain standards and not fast at all by others. Julia told Agnes Henderson first, because Agnes was her closest friend in Harlan Creek, and because Agnes had been gently suggesting this possibility for longer than Julia wanted to admit. Agnes cried with happiness and then immediately began talking about what could be done with Julia's hair for the occasion. She told Nora before she told anyone else, the morning after Clayton asked, sitting at the kitchen table before Nora's lessons. Nora listened with great seriousness and then said, "Are we going to live at the Rocking R or is he going to live here?" "We have not decided yet," Julia said. What would you prefer? Nora considered this with genuine thoughtfulness. The rocking R is larger, she said, and there is the foal, but I would miss the mare. We could bring the mare, Julia said. Then the rocking R, Nora said, with a finality that was entirely her own, and then she went back to her arithmetic. They were married in June. Reverend Miles conducted the ceremony in the church on a Saturday morning when the summer was new enough to be beautiful rather than punishing. And the whole of Harlan Creek turned out, because in a small Texas town in 1874, a wedding was an occasion, and this one in particular had been observed in its making by enough people that everyone felt some investment in it. Moses Webb stood with Clayton at the front of the church, which was not the usual arrangement but was the right one, and Julia walked in on Nora's arm, because Nora had asked to walk with her and Julia had said yes, and thought she would remember the sight of her daughter's serious, proud, 9-year-old face for the rest of her life. Julia wore a dress she had made herself from a blue wool that Agnes had helped her select, and she wore her hair up the way Agnes had insisted on, and she thought she looked well enough for the occasion. And then she saw Clayton's face when she came through the door of the church, and she stopped thinking about how she looked because his expression told her everything she needed to know about it. She had expected the ceremony to feel solemn, and it did, but it also felt like something coming home. Reverend Miles spoke about partnership and about the kind of love that is built rather than found, that grows from decision and action, and from choosing someone again every day rather than from a single overwhelming moment. And Julia thought that this was the most accurate description of what had happened between her and Clayton Ramsey that she had heard from anyone, including from either of them. She said her vows with a clear voice and looked at him when she said them and meant every word. He said his with the same economy and certainty he brought to everything that mattered, and she felt the words land in her the way good things land, permanently. Gideon Hart attended the wedding. He sat in the third row from the back and smiled with all his teeth and afterward shook Clayton's hand and said he hoped the new union would be a prosperous one. Clayton thanked him without warmth and moved on, and Julia noticed that after the wedding Hart did not approach her alone again. She suspected this was because the calculation had changed. She was no longer an isolated widow with a debt. She was now one half of the rocking R and Talbot land, which combined was not a property anyone could reasonably pressure with the tools Hart had been using. She felt no triumph about this, only relief, and she filed it away and let it go. The summer was the best Julia had known in Texas. They moved her cattle to the rocking R's south pasture, and the combined herd was something to be proud of. They hired a second full hand, a man named Carl Bridges who was 38 and had been ranching since he was 12, and who worked with the quiet competence of someone who does not need to announce themselves. Julia paid off the bank debt in July and the mercantile in August, and she walked out of Abel Cross's store after that final payment with nothing owed to no one, and felt the lightness of it in every part of her body. She ran the Talbot 40 alongside the rocking R as a discrete piece of the larger operation, because she had decided this was both sensible and important to her, and Clayton had agreed without requiring an explanation of why, which was how she had known she had made the right choice in him. The fall of 1874 was beautiful. The rains came at the right time and the grass stayed good and the herd was healthy, and in October Julia discovered she was pregnant, which she received with a complex and layered joy that included the memory of Thomas and the reality of Clayton, and the fact that Nora's face, when told, went through 6 distinct emotions in about 2 seconds before settling into a happiness that was entirely unqualified. "A brother or a sister?" Nora asked. "We will not know until the spring," Julia said. "I will accept either one," Nora said, with the magnanimity of a child who has decided to be generous, "but I think a brother would be instructive." Clayton, who was present for this exchange, did not say anything but put his arm around Julia in the way he sometimes did, the way that was not possessive but was protective and warm, and she leaned into it because she had stopped resisting the simple pleasure of being held by someone she loved without reservation. They spent that first winter together in the rocking R, all three of them, and then four of them as the spring approached, and the baby made his presence increasingly known. Julia continued working through the winter the way she always had, though Clayton and Moses and the hands quietly arranged to make certain that the heaviest work found other hands, which she allowed because she was not so proud as to be stupid about it, and because she trusted these men to know where the line was between consideration and interference. December brought Clayton's birthday, which she had learned was the 14th, and she made him a meal that took all day and included everything she knew he loved, which she had been cataloging quietly since February. He came in from the cold to a table that smelled of all of it and looked at her with an expression she had come to know as the one he wore when he was feeling something too large for the economy of his usual expression, and he said nothing for a moment, and then said her name in a way that said everything. "Sit down," she said, "before it gets cold." He sat down and ate with the appreciation of a man who understands what went into what he is tasting, and afterward, when the kitchen was quiet and the fire was down to coals and Nora was asleep and the wind was at the windows, he said, "I want to tell you something." "Tell me," she said. "I was not a happy man before you," he said. "I was a functioning man. I was a working man, but I was not happy. I had not been for a long time, maybe since my mother died, and I had stopped expecting to be. And then I saw you at a fence line in November with a maul in your hands and your hair plastered to your face, and you looked at me like you expected me to be a problem. And I thought, well, there is a woman who is completely herself, and I want to know everything about that." He was quiet for a moment. "I have not been sorry for a single day of it." Julia looked at him across the table, this man who had come to her fence line in the rain with an offer of work and a question, this man who had kept his word about everything and built a life with her through the slow daily decision of it, and she felt the love for him as a thing that had roots now, deep ones, the kind that hold in weather. "I have not been sorry either," she said. "Not for one day." He reached across the table and took her hand, and they sat like that for a while in the quiet kitchen with the coals glowing and the Texas winter pressing gently at the windows, and there was nothing that needed to be said, and so neither of them said anything. The baby was born in late March of 1875, during a warm spell that felt like a gift from a country that had been testing them for years and had decided they had earned something easy. Dr. Emmett Vance delivered him with his usual calm, and Nora sat in the kitchen with Moses and refused to go outside because she had decided she wanted to be present in the house for whatever was happening, and Moses had made her tea and read to her from the book of natural history that Clayton had finally given her as her own Christmas gift. The baby was a boy, as Nora had predicted with such confidence, and he was large and loud and unmistakably healthy, and when the doctor put him in Clayton's arms, Clayton held him with the steadiness he brought to everything important, though his eyes went bright in a way that was entirely outside his usual economy of expression, and he looked at Julia over the baby's head with an expression she thought she would carry for the rest of her life. They named him Thomas Clayton Ramsey, because Julia had asked and Clayton had said yes without hesitation, and because the name was a way of saying that the past and the present were not in conflict, and that the boy who would grow up on the rocking R could carry something of the man who had brought his mother to Texas, and that this was all right, that it was more than all right. Nora took her role as older sister with a seriousness that eclipsed everything else in her life for a solid month. She informed the household regularly about what the baby needed and what the baby appeared to prefer, and what the baby's expressions indicated. And Moses listened to all of this with grave attention, and Clayton listened with amusement he mostly concealed, and Julia listened with a love for both of them, her daughter and her son, that was so large it sometimes stopped her breath. By the summer of 1875, The Rocking R and the Talbot 40 combined were the most productive operation on Harlan Creek. Clayton had the north pasture fully cleared and fenced, and they ran nearly 90 head on the combined property, which was not the largest outfit in the county but was far from the smallest. They had gone to Fort Worth for the spring drive again, this time with a better herd and better terms because their combined reputation as reliable sellers with quality cattle had preceded them from the previous year. Moses Webb took a parcel of land on the east edge of the property that Clayton deeded to him formally in August of that year. It was something Clayton had been planning since before Julia arrived, and he had waited until the property was financially solid enough to do it in a way that would hold up to any legal challenge. Because in 1875 in Texas, a black man owning land was something that required every piece of paper to be exactly right. Julia had helped write the documentation because she had a careful hand and good grammar and understood the legal language from the months she had spent reading her own property documents. Moses read every word, as Julia had taught him to by example, and signed with the gravity of a man who had been waiting for something like this for his entire life. "Thank you," he said to both of them, which was all he said, and it was enough. Gideon Hart made one more attempt, in the fall of '75, to acquire pieces of what was now the Ramsey property. He presented himself at the ranch house on a Tuesday afternoon with a new offer and a new calculation, and Julia answered the door because Clayton was in the north pasture, and she saw no reason to wait. She listened to his offer with complete attention, and then told him, in the clearest possible terms, that neither the Talbot 40 nor any portion of the Rocking R was for sale at any price, and that she would appreciate it if he took note of this answer as a final one and directed his business elsewhere. She said this without anger and without heat, because she did not feel anger. She felt the solid confidence of a woman who owned what she owned and owed nothing to anyone, and was standing in the doorway of a house that was hers by love and by law and by the 3 years of hard work that had preceded it. Hart looked at her for a moment with his calculating eyes, and then nodded and said good day and left, and he did not come back. The winter of '75 going into '76 was mild, which felt like a reward. Thomas Clayton Ramsey grew through it at the pace of babies, which is to say rapidly, and in ways that continually surprised his parents. He laughed early and laughed often, and had his mother's brown hair and his father's gray eyes, and by January he was pulling himself upright at the furniture and looking at the world with the alert, serious expression of a person who is determined to get somewhere. Nora turned 11 in the spring of '76 and was, in Julia's assessment, one of the most self-possessed 11-year-olds in Texas. She had started at the county school that had finally organized the previous fall, and she was at the top of every lesson including arithmetic, which she had stopped claiming to dislike once she found she was better at it than almost everyone else in the class. She rode her own horse, a bay named Consequence who had a habit of spooking at nothing, and who Nora managed with a calm competence that she had learned from watching Clayton and Moses without ever asking for a lesson. In April of '76, Julia found herself at the fence line again. Not splitting rails this time, but walking the line with Clayton on a morning that was fresh and green, and full of the kind of bird noise that means winter is fully behind you. The baby was with Moses, who had appointed himself chief caretaker with a solemnity that the baby rewarded by preferring Moses's arms to nearly anyone else's. Nora was at school. They walked the east line, the one that had been the boundary between their properties before those properties became one, and Julia looked at the fence post she had set 3 years ago, good solid work that had held through 2 hard winters and a flood year, and felt the particular satisfaction of work that lasts. "This was where you rode up that morning," she said. "It was," he said. "You were so careful," she said. "You rode up like you had all the time in the world." "I had been working up to it for 8 months," he said. "I had plenty of time by that point." She looked at him. "8 months? I decided in March of '73 that I wanted to ask you something," he said. It took me until November to settle on when and how, and then I rode out and you were standing in the rain-splitting rails and I thought, well, she is not going to make this easy, which was the most predictable thing I could have predicted about you, and I got off the horse." She laughed fully and freely. 8 months. "In my defense," he said, "you are a formidable woman." "You told me you were a plain man," she said. "I am a plain man," he said. "Plain does not mean simple." "It took me 8 months to work out the plainest possible way to ask." She took his hand as they walked, and he closed his fingers around hers, and the fence line stretched ahead of them through the April grass, straight and sound and running all the way to the horizon, and the cattle moved in the pasture beyond it. And somewhere back at the house, Moses was telling young Thomas Clayton Ramsey something that was making the baby laugh, and Nora was at school learning arithmetic that she was going to be very good at. And the rocking R and the Talbot 40 lay together under the wide Texas sky like two things that had always been meant to meet. "Clayton," she said. "Julia," he said. "I am glad you got off the horse," she said. He stopped walking and turned to look at her in the April morning light. This woman he had loved since the day he found her in the rain. This woman who had split her own fence rails and paid her own debts and built her own life and had made room in it for him, not because she needed him, but because she wanted him, which was a better and truer thing than need. And his face did the thing it did when he felt something larger than his usual economy of expression could contain. "I am glad every day," he said. She moved toward him and he put his arms around her, and she felt the solidity of him and the warmth of him, and the 3 years of Tuesday mornings and Sunday afternoons, and the cattle drive and the fire in the kitchen and young Thomas's laugh and Nora's serious face, and the weight of the debts she had carried, and the lightness of the life she had built, all of it at once, and she thought that this was what it was to be genuinely happy. Not the absence of difficulty, but the presence of something true enough and solid enough to carry you through the difficulty when it came, which it would come, because it was Texas and it was life and nothing was easy for long. But this was long. This was the long kind. She knew that the way she knew weather now, from the accumulation of signs too numerous to doubt, and she held on to him in the April morning on the fence line that had once divided two pieces of land and now was just a line through the middle of theirs. They had their second child in the winter of 1877, another boy, which Nora accepted with equanimity and named immediately and without consultation, calling him James because she had been reading extensively and had decided James was the kind of name that aged well. James Ramsey was smaller than his brother at birth, but made up for it in volume and doctor. Vance said he was perfect, and Clayton held him with the same steadiness and bright eyes he had brought to Thomas Clayton, and Julia looked at her family assembled in the bedroom of the rocking R on that winter evening and felt the fullness of it, everything she had built and been given and chosen, all the way to the edges. Young Thomas was 2 by then and had learned to walk, and had decided that the barn was the most interesting location on the property, and Moses had appointed himself the primary supervisor of this exploration, and it was not unusual to find them there in the late afternoons, the old foreman and the 2-year-old, engaged in what appeared to be serious conversation about the horses. Clayton had expanded the north pasture fully by that spring, and they ran 103 head, which made them the second largest cattle operation in the county, and the first drive of 1877 was the most profitable either of them had known. Abel Cross told Clayton at the general store that word had gotten to the county seat about the quality of rocking R cattle, and that a buyer from Colorado had been asking after them. Julia continued to manage the Talbot 40 as the south pasture of the combined operation, and she kept the books for the whole property because she was better at it than Clayton, who acknowledged this freely and was not diminished by it. The books were accurate and current, and showed a property that was not only solvent but growing, and she looked at those numbers sometimes in the evenings when the boys were asleep, and Nora was reading, and Clayton was doing some last piece of work by the fire, and she thought about the woman who had stood in November rain with a maul in her hands and a debt on her back and 40 acres of Texas that she was holding together by determination alone. That woman was still here. She recognized her in the hands that held the ledger, in the back that still knew the particular ache of a long day's work, in the eyes that had learned to read weather and cattle and land the way you read a language you grew up speaking. But that woman had a life around her now that she had not been able to see in full in those early years, a life that had grown not despite the work and the difficulty but through it, the way good timber grows through weather into something you can build with. She put the ledger away and went to stand beside Clayton at the fire, and he looked up from whatever he was doing and moved to make room for her without being asked, the way long-known people make room for each other, automatically and warmly, and without thinking it was anything other than what it was, which was everything. "The books are good," she said. "They always are when you keep them," he said. "Do not be flattering," she said. "I am not," he said. "I am accurate. There is a difference." She settled against his side and he put his arm around her, and the fire burned down slowly, and outside the Texas night was clear and cold and full of stars, and the rocking R lay quiet around them, the cattle in the pasture and the horses in the barn and the children asleep in the rooms above, and Moses in his own house on his own land, and Carl Bridges and Sam Price and young Dalt and Hector in the bunkhouse, and the fence lined straight and sound across the dark land in every direction. There was nothing unresolved, nothing owed, nothing waiting to fall apart. There was only this, the warmth of the fire and the weight of his arm and the knowledge, deep and certain, and accumulated from 1,000 small decisions made with care, that she was where she was supposed to be and that it was good and that it would hold. The rain had begun to fall again outside, soft and steady, the same kind of rain that had come in on that November morning 3 years and a lifetime ago, and Julia Talbot Ramsey listened to it on the roof, and thought that she loved the rain now in a way she had not before, that she could not hear it without thinking of a man riding a sorrel through a November fence line, and getting off his horse, and standing in the weather with his hat in his hands and saying, plain and honest and a little bit nervous, that he had come to do that and also to ask her something. She was glad she had let him ask. She was glad she had answered. She closed her eyes and listened to the rain on the roof of the rocking R, and felt the weight of her husband's arm across her shoulders and the warmth of the fire before them and the sound of her children breathing in the rooms above. And she let all of it in, completely and without reservation, and she was, in every part of her, home.